Estonia is building a wall of war, and Russia is the reason. While the world watches Ukraine, Estonia is preparing for what could come next. Alongside Latvia and Lithuania, it's launching the Baltic Defense Line, a sweeping multi-country project to turn their shared borders with Russia and Belarus into one giant military barricade. We're talking 600 concrete bunkers, fortified supply points, and layered defenses stretching across NATO's eastern edge. If Russia tries to roll west, it won't be easy or cheap. So what exactly is being built, and why is Estonia, of all countries, taking the lead? To answer that, we have to rewind the clock way back before modern Estonia or Russia even existed. In the late 1980s, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania existed as union republics within the Soviet system. But unlike other Soviet territories that have been part of the Russian Empire for centuries, the Baltic states maintain distinct national identities, languages, and cultures that never fully assimilated into the Soviet framework. Sure, the Soviet efforts to repopulate the war, struck nations, and remove national identities over unitary ones meant resettling Russians to the region and emigrating natives out. But the core Baltic culture remained vastly different from other European nations within the Union or even in the Warsaw Pact. Surprisingly, the Baltic states also had a constitutional right to secede from the USSR, which was mainly theoretical and perfunctory. However, as the Soviet Union's economy faltered during the late 1980s, increased calls for autonomy and outright independence led to the three states becoming the first Soviet territories to exercise it. What set the breakaway Baltics apart from the other former Soviet republics was their nearly immediate turn to the West shortly after regaining independence, rather than trying to patch their relationship with the Russian Federation. All three countries successfully pursued similar programs of political and economic reform, remaking themselves as democracies with booming market potential. With European integration and revitalization of their cultures, they joined both NATO and the European Union in 2004. However, NATO membership wasn't just about economics or prestige. For the small Baltic states that were perilously close to Russia's largest population centers and navy ports on the Baltic Sea, it was about survival. What might surprise you is just how little Vladimir Putin, who was already president when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined NATO in 2004, initially cared about that pro-Western shift. His reaction at the time was remarkably muted by today's standards. The 2003 Rose Revolution in Georgia escalated U.S.-Russian tensions significantly. Putin blamed the United States directly for assisting this democratic breakthrough and helping install someone whom he saw as a pro-American puppet, President Mikhail Saakashvili. This would outline a pattern that actually started from past NATO actions in Yugoslavia in 1999 and will be repeated throughout the 21st century. Putin wasn't primarily threatened by NATO's military capabilities, as NATO is a defensive alliance. It has never attacked the Soviet Union or Russia, and it likely never will. Putin knows that. The real threat came from NATO's determination to support democracies and undermine oppressive governments, at least as seen through NATO's lens, often by using the alliance's position as the largest and best-funded military power. This goes double for a major post-Soviet country like Ukraine, which was the second largest and militarily prominent breakaway nation from the Union, with the closest demographics and culture to Russia. Putin can't have a successful and democratic Ukraine on Russia's border that doesn't have ties to Russia. This is where Estonia and the other Baltic states became a problem for Putin that extended far beyond military strategy. The Baltics were proof that former Soviet peoples could thrive without Russian control, a sentiment that obviously echoed in Ukraine. For the first decade of Baltic NATO membership, the defensive concerns remained largely theoretical. There were occasional tensions and military exercises, but the prospect of actual conflict seemed remote. Then 2014 changed everything. Russia's annexation of Crimea. In February 2014, following protests for closer ties with the West and the removal of Ukraine's pro-Russia president from office, raised concern among NATO members about the potential for similar Russian actions in the Baltics. The implication for the Baltic states, with terrifying and immediate Baltic leaders, took the lessons of the Crimea conflict to heart. They concluded that they needed to be able to respond quickly to the first signs of similar pressure from Russia against their own countries. But the real shock came in 2016, after NATO conducted war games to test its ability to defend the Baltic states. The results were sobering, beyond anyone's worst fears. War games from 2014 and 15 found that Russian troops could enter the Estonian capital of Tallinn and the Latvian capital of Riga within 60 hours, practically blitzkrieging through the Baltic and preventing any kind of unified NATO response before it was too late. NATO's own simulations suggested that two national capitals of alliance members could fall in less than 3 days. The implications were staggering. Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which commits all members to defend any attacked ally, would be meaningless if those allies were overrun before help could arrive. This vulnerability was now compounded by a geographic nightmare that military strategists call the Suwalki Gap. The narrow 40 to 60-mile corridor along the Polish-Lithuanian border has emerged as one of the most strategically vulnerable regions in Europe. Widely referred to as NATO's Achilles heel, this vital land bridge separates Russia's heavily militarized Kaliningrad exclave from Belarus, which is practically Russia-light at this point. Since the Suwalki Gap is the only land connection between NATO's Baltic member states and the rest of Europe, control over this corridor would enable Russia to cut off Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia from NATO reinforcements overland. The strategic path to Russia's goal is brutal and simple. Overwhelm the Baltic states, cut off its only land route to the rest of NATO, and force a government overthrow before the rest of the alliance could get its militaries mobilized. Of course, recent years have shifted this equation slightly in NATO's favor, as both Sweden and Finland joined in the 2020s. The two newest members will be able to provide vital aerial and naval support as a first response. What fully turned the tenuous relationship between Russia and NATO to outward hostility was the start of the war in Ukraine, which practically removed any notion that Russia was ambivalent or friendly toward its former Soviet neighbors. For the Baltic states, the invasion in 2022 was essentially a preview of what might be coming next. However, the war in Ukraine also revealed something that fundamentally changed the strategic calculus. Russia's military wasn't the unstoppable force that NATO planners had feared. The same army that was supposed to capture Baltic capitals in 36 hours struggled to take Ukrainian cities for months. How do three relatively small nations create viable defensive plans when their only real link to the outside world is the same country they're trying to defend against? The answer is the planned Baltic Defense Line, which was publicly announced on January 19, 2024 at a meeting between the ministers of defense of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania in Riga. The scope of the project is staggering by any measure. Based on the initial agreement, the estimated $65 million anti-mobility installation project will see bunkers rise throughout 2025 and beyond. But Estonia's portion alone reveals the true ambition of this undertaking. The new bunkers, similar to underground cellars already commonly found in Estonia, are expected to be 35 square meters, 377 square feet, hardened to withstand artillery strikes and house up to 10 soldiers. The Estonian government has suggested that the project envisions the defensive line not as a final stand. Instead, it's meant to deter Russia from conducting a full-on assault across the Russia-Baltic states border and focus on predetermined locations that would be less defended, but which would get increased NATO support in turn. The strategy is also more sophisticated than permanent defensive fortifications. In March 2025, the Baltic states and Poland announced their withdrawal from the Ottawa Treaty, citing rising Russian aggression and the need for mines as a vital component of modern defensive warfare, especially in the narrow, contested terrain of the Baltic region. Since early 2024, when the initial plans for the line were announced, the Baltics had roughly a year and a half to exercise the plan in reality. For Estonia, construction began in June 2025. This is woefully behind Latvia, where the first construction efforts were reported as early as May 2024. The first signs of the defense line are anti-tank ditches being dug in villages that are closest to the Estonia-Russia border, with the first such ditch reported in Vinski. Each trench is approximately 13 feet wide, 6.5 feet deep, and stretches for 2.5 miles. The ditches are designed to serve as guides for Russia's mechanized infantry, a main battle tank. They would either slow down the advance or force senior Russian officers to adapt and change the plan of attack, which is not Russia's forte by the looks of its track record in Ukraine. But the ditches are just the beginning. By the end of the year, Estonia plans to build 28 bunkers and 10 ammunition storage facilities. Three countries combined don't have a large enough military force or land between their border and their capitals to mount a decisive stance. However, the bunker line is not actually meant to stop a Russian attack, but shape it, as former Estonian Defense Forces Commander General Martin Harum explained. The actual strategy is more nuanced and potentially more effective. The Ukrainian conflict has shown that even small delays and complications can have massive effects on military operations. Russia's initial assumption that it could capture Kyiv in days was shattered by Ukrainian resistance that forced Russian forces into costly urban warfare and extended supply lines. This led to logistics breakdowns that allowed Ukraine to retake most of the territory it lost in the first few weeks of the invasion. The Baltic Defense Line is designed to create similar complications, but on a much more systematic level, by forcing Russian forces to either bypass heavily fortified positions, thus extending their supply lines and exposing their flanks, or assault prepared defensive positions, causing casualties and delays. The line changes the fundamentals of the invasion and forces Russia to be the one to adapt, rather than the Baltics adapting to Russian advances. The Baltic Defense Line isn't just a military project, it's reshaping Estonian society, as the country is expecting to have 4,000 more combat-ready troops by the end of the decade. This is a staggering number when the country's total population is 1.3 million, and the current active troop size is only 7,700. Estonia's Defense Forces website states this will lead to half the men born in a given year serving in the military, being one of the few NATO members that maintains mandatory military service. The social transformation goes beyond military training. Children are now receiving basic military education in high schools, and families are rehearsing evacuation scenarios. Estonia is essentially preparing its entire population for the possibility of conflict, but this preparation reveals internal challenges. Estonia has a significant ethnic Russian population thanks to its Soviet history, which is concentrated especially in the same regions where much of the Baltic Defense Line is being built. According to a 2024 survey commissioned by the Ministry of Defense, 67% of ethnic Estonians would give up their land to defense forces if Estonia were attacked, as opposed to only 38% of non-ethnic Estonians. Some people are not directly opposed to the construction efforts per se, but are worried that they would become a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that Russia would attempt to attack before the defensive line is complete. The answer to this is to ensure that the rest of NATO can muster its forces and economies to fully support both Ukraine and the Baltics and deter further Russian aggression. The success or failure of the Baltic Defense Line will likely influence defense planning across the globe. If the project proves effective at deterring aggression, expect to see similar approaches in other vulnerable regions. If it fails to deter or proves ineffective in actual conflict, the lessons will reshape military thinking for decades.